Hey 10, Mrs. Tamisari here with another tutorial. This week is significant because we've reached the central act of the play. We're almost at the halfway mark. And as usual, if you haven't already done so, you need to pause and read through the scene so that everything I say makes sense to you and is building on knowledge that you already have. Okay, now this is not a particularly long scene. It's a bit longer than last week's, but and we'll see that it's not really loaded with language features and imagery and clever things like that, but it is dramatically quite important because this scene is positioned in the play to highlight the transformation in the characters. So we see how Banquo is different, but more importantly, we start to see how Macbeth is deteriorating now that he's killed Duncan. And so this scene is all about pointing that out. Okay, so what happens in the scene? First of all, Macbeth is king now, and we catch him in this scene the afternoon before his coronation banquet. So if you remember in Act 2, Scene 4, we were told that Macbeth had gone off to Scone to be crowned. Now he has been, he's come back, and he's going to have a banquet to celebrate. The first person we meet in this scene, though, is Banquo, and he tells us that he suspects foul play, so he believes Macbeth to have been the murderer. And then Macbeth comes into the scene and questions Banquo to find out what his plans are for the day. And Macbeth's plotting again. Banquo tells us that he's going riding with his son Fleaunt and that he's going to be gone for hours. And after Banquo leaves, Macbeth is left alone and he reflects on the prophecies and he realises that his reign as king is not secure because he has no heir. And he resents the fact that when he dies, the crown is going to pass to Banquo. And this stirs him up. And what he does is meet with two murderers, and he convinces and persuades them to kill Banquo and Fleaunt because he believes that that's going to make his rule more secure. And the scene ends with him making arrangements to meet again with the murderers to outline the plan that he's going to come up with so that they don't fail to kill Banquo and Fleaunt. So that's basically it. Now, let's get into the analysis, and the first thing we need to notice is where this scene is taking place. Now, Macbeth has not gone home to Dunsinane. He is at Forres. Now, Forres is Duncan's palace. It's the palace of the king, and so this builds on this idea that Macbeth is trying to appear like a king. We're going to look at that in a minute, but he's located himself where Duncan lived so that it shows him as being more kingly. All right, it's where we first saw Macbeth and Duncan together. And the opening of the scene is Banquo's reflections on the events that have happened between Act 2, Scene 4 and this point in the play. So remember, this is set in the 1200s, and we've got to have had time for Macbeth to go all the way to Scone and get back to Forres. We've got to have had Banquo get from Dunsinane to Forres, and we're going to see that actually in a couple of scenes' time, there's loads of people at this banquet, and so there's got to have been time for them to get there as well. So this play compresses time right down. The play is about 2 hours long, but it actually covers several years of Scottish history, and so Banquo fills in the gap for us and tells us what has happened in the gap that would have happened between Act 2, Scene 4 and 3-1. Okay. So he tells us that Macbeth has been crowned, Duncan has been buried, and suspicions have grown. This is still a live case. No one's solved the crime of the murder of Duncan, and so suspicions are growing about who was responsible. With time to reflect, Banquo has concluded that Macbeth had the most to gain, and he reflects on the witch's prophecies and knows that Macbeth benefited from the murder of Duncan. to the extent that he believes that Macbeth is the murderer. And he also, at this point, acknowledges the truth in the witches' prophecies. He acknowledges that they've all come true for Macbeth. So he's also reflecting on that. So let's have a look at his language. First of all, look at this opening phrase. It's not a complete sentence. It's a lengthy sentence. In fact, the whole of this first speech is only 2 sentences. And his thoughts and conclusions tumble out. It's loads of really brief clauses, one after the other, and lots of enjambment in this section that creates pace. It shows us that he's been thinking about this for a long time, and it all just tumbles out of him. And he makes it absolutely clear that he believes that Macbeth is the murderer. He believes that Macbeth played foul to get the crown, and he links that to the prophecies. All right, and he revisits them, and he remembers that he himself had a prophecy. It wasn't just Macbeth, but he himself had a prophecy that he was going to be the father of kings. And he thinks that if there has been truth for Macbeth, that perhaps there will be truth for him too. And worryingly, he says that he is now going to be guided by that prophecy that he received. Now, we've seen Macbeth guided by the prophecies, and it's gone in a very dark direction. And so this is quite worrying, because Banquo, up to this point, has been a man who has kept those prophecies at arm's length. He told us in Act 2, Scene 1, that the thought of the witches was giving him nightmares, so that he was frightened to go to sleep. But now he seems to be embracing them and using them as a guide to determine what he's going to do next. Now, we know that he's going to die. Macbeth's going to kill him. But I just want to throw the question out there. What if Macbeth hadn't killed him? I wonder what would have happened to Banquo's character. Would he have gone the same way as Macbeth? Or is he fundamentally a good man? And thinking about these questions makes you think about the character of Banquo and form an opinion about him, so that you can write really well about him if you are asked a question on Banquo in the exam. Just a thought. Now, his speech ends with him quietening himself and sort of going silent because people are coming into the scene. And it reminds us that what we've just heard is a soliloquy. These are Banquo's secret thoughts. And we know from our previous tutorials and our previous study that soliloquies tell us the truth in the play. They're a way for the writer to tell us what's really going on for the characters. And so what Banquo's just said is what he really thinks and feels. Now, this is the first time we see Macbeth and Lady Macbeth as king and queen, and the whole setup is to make it look artificial. It's meant to make them look like they're playing the part. Remember, Macbeth has usurped the throne. Usurping is when you take authority that doesn't belong to you. And he's not a legitimate king. And so everything about the way they behave and the way that they look and the way that they speak is all really fake and artificial. And this is Macbeth trying to play at being king, but he might be king in name, he might be wearing a crown, but he's not a king in his heart and in his character. That sort of legitimate rule that's given by God hasn't been given to Macbeth, and so that's why it's all a little bit artificial and fake. Remember, our word last week was contrived, and that's what's going on here. And so the first thing to notice is the way Lady Macbeth speaks. Remember when Macduff woke her up when he discovered Duncan's body? She was quite rude and abrasive with him, but here she's full of flattery. She's really gushing about Banquo, and we know it's not really her. And so It's more than we've seen her say to Banquo at any point in the play. But it's not really her. It's too late. We're unconvinced because we've seen what she's really like. So even though she's trying to be like a queen, it's not convincing. Okay, so the next thing we see is Macbeth trying to be king, and he talks to Banquo about the fact that there's going to be a feast later, and he tells Banquo that it's important that Banquo attends. But again, if we look closely, we've got a command here dressed up as an invitation. He says, "I'll request your presence." It's very commanding and prescriptive. He's telling Banquo to be there. And so what we see is that Macbeth is there's already harshness, there's already control in the way that he's ruling right at the beginning. And we see this through the rest of the play. This command dressed as an invitation foreshadows the way Macbeth's reign is going to go in the rest of the play. Now, Banquo responds really respectfully, in spite of his suspicions. He's shrewd, he's a clever man, and he doesn't know what he's going to do about Macbeth's guilt yet. And so he plays the part of the loyal servant. So all of the warmth and ease of their early conversations in the play has gone. They're both guarded. Macbeth and Banquo are quite guarded with each other because they're sounding each other out, and they've both got other things going on in their minds. Banquo suspects Macbeth. Macbeth doesn't trust Banquo, and we can see it in how sort of clipped and guarded their conversation is. Now, Macbeth hides seemingly innocent questions in a longer conversation to cover up the fact that he's on the hunt for information. And so you notice here that he asks where Banquo's going. Are you going riding this afternoon? Macbeth is still plotting. And this is him getting ready to meet the murderers, to send them out to kill Banquo. And he implies a reason for his questions. He makes it sound like he's interested in where Banquo's going because he would have liked to have met with Banquo to get some advice about being king. It's totally fake. What he's doing here is setting up an alibi. He says, we'll meet tomorrow instead. And of course, if Macbeth is planning a meeting the following day with Banquo, it throws suspicion off him when Banquo is murdered later on that afternoon. Why would Macbeth have murdered him? He couldn't have done. He'd got a meeting planned. So this is Macbeth trying to create an alibi to throw people off the scent. He throws in another question at the end of that paragraph, at the end of that little section there. He seeks more information, and Banquo tells him a little bit too much. He says that he's going to be out for several hours and maybe after dark, even if his horse won't go very fast. Now, that tells Macbeth that he's going to have plenty of time to arrange the murder, but also he might have the benefit of darkness. The murderers might be able to catch Banquo after dark to conceal what they're doing. So Banquo inadvertently gives too much information away there. Now look at Macbeth's language. He's deflecting the blame for Duncan's murder back to Malcolm and Donalbain. Now, Banquo hasn't brought this up. This is Macbeth. Look at his language here. It's like propaganda. Look how he describes them. Our bloody cousins. They're cruel parricide. Parricide is murder of a father. It's sometimes spelt patricide. But it's murder of their father. And then we've got strange invention. So he's creating an illusion of the guilt of Malcolm and Donalbain and adding fuel to the fire of suspicion that surrounds them since they ran away. And once again, right at the end of this section, Macbeth hides another question there. And it makes it sound like he's just asking off the top of his head, but he's being really duplicitous because he's seeking information. Now he wants to know if Fleance is going to be there as well. And Banquo says, of course, Fleance is going. Now, this is Shakespeare taking us back to the beginning of Act 2, where we see Banquo and Fleance together, and he's reminding us that in spite of that question mark that Banquo has created at the beginning of this scene, we're reminded that Banquo is a good man and a good father, and he's got a little son, and they're close. And so we're reminded of those qualities about Banquo so that we feel more sympathy for him later on. Now, off Banquo goes for his ride, and Macbeth is left with the entourage, and he tells everybody that they can do their own thing for the rest of the afternoon. And again, this is Macbeth appearing to be kingly. It sounds like benevolence or kindness towards his subjects. You can go and do what you like. I've got no jobs for you to do. But actually, he's got another motivation. He wants to be alone so that he can have his meeting. So off they go, and they're going to meet again at 7 at night for the banquet. And so everybody but Macbeth and his servant goes. And at this point, the attendant tells us that there are 2 men waiting at the gate of Forres Castle to speak to Macbeth. And so Macbeth sends the attendant off to get them. Now, who are these men? We're going to meet them in a minute. And so off the attendant goes, and Macbeth is now left alone, and he goes into his soliloquy. So we've had Banquo's soliloquy, now we get Macbeth's. And this is where Macbeth reveals what's troubling him, because he is not a happy man. Shakespeare uses this scene to show us what's motivating each of the characters. And Macbeth is motivated by 2 things. We know he's motivated by ambition, but the other thing that is plaguing him is that he has no children. And so Banquo's been busy thinking about Macbeth's guilt and the witch's prophecies, but Macbeth is also thinking about the witch's prophecies and what that means about the security of his reign. He knows that when he dies, because he's got no children, the crown will pass to Banquo, and this really bothers him. And he starts his soliloquy with a bit of a confession almost. He reveals that even though he's now the king, he's got everything he wanted, he is not satisfied. And this is the problem with these fatal flaws that tragic heroes have. It's fundamental to who they are. And so if you've got a problem with ambition, it doesn't matter what you get, there's always going to be more that you want. So here Macbeth links the idea with being king and being unhappy with being king. The repetition of thus shows the connection between these 2 ideas. But it also shows us that he's not naming the role. He doesn't say to be king is nothing, but to be safely king. He just says thus. Now that shows us how little value he now places on that role. It's not enough for him to be king. He needs to be safely king. And this would continue. If he was safely king, there'd be something else that would be the issue, because ambition is his driving quality. Remember that word hamartia, the fatal flaw of the tragic hero. But Banquo knows too much, and so he's afraid, he's scared that Banquo is going to bring down the House of Cards, and he feels like he needs to do something about that. He then talks about Banquo a little bit, and actually he uses lots of abstract nouns here to describe Banquo's character. Look at them all. He says royalty, his nature, his dauntless temper, his mind, he has a wisdom, he's got valour. And all of these abstract nouns show us the quality of Banquo. And although Macbeth doesn't say it, Shakespeare shows us that actually Banquo is a far more kingly character than Macbeth. In many ways, Banquo would be a much more legitimate king. And so although Macbeth doesn't point that out, he's comparing himself with the qualities of Banquo. And we know that Macbeth might have been these things in the past, but now he's a murderer, he's a liar, he's a thief, he's a usurper, he's a plotter. All of these things are true of him, but the opposite is true of Banquo. So what we're seeing here, this soliloquy shows us how much Macbeth has deteriorated since the beginning of the play. Remember how much anguish Macbeth felt over the thought of killing Duncan. We had a 4-scene build-up where Macbeth was wrestling with the idea. Here, doesn't bat an eyelid. He's planning to kill Banquo, and he's not worried about it at all. He's just legitimising the reasons for it. He's telling himself why he's got to do it. He hardly hesitates, and it's almost like, we're going to see in a minute, the murder of Fleance is almost like an afterthought. It's just an add-on. No concern about it whatsoever. He says that Banquo makes him feel inferior. He says, my genius is rebuked. Genius here is like equivalent to ego. Banquo is the better man, and Macbeth knows it, and it makes Macbeth feel bad. And so the question we need to ask here is, what is motivating Macbeth? Is it ambition? Is it envy, which is a desire for something you haven't got? Is it jealousy, the need to protect something you have got? Or is it all of these things together? What we see is where he had one flaw, perhaps earlier in the play, now all of these negative qualities are motivating him. And he is also here reflecting on the prophecies. But unlike Banquo, Banquo leaves it. He thinks about them and then leaves it and goes off for his ride. But Macbeth can't stop. He can't let it go. And actually, the prophecies here make him more determined to make his reign secure, his kingship secure, because he knows that otherwise Banquo is going to benefit. Look at the semantic field that is used in this next section. He talks about the witches placing on his head a fruitless crown and a barren sceptre, and we've got unlineal and no son. And so the semantic field here is one of infertility. He highlights how significant this concern is to him by repeating the idea in lots of different ways. And what he's showing us is not just that he's got no son, but having no son means he hasn't got an heir. And if he hasn't got an heir, he doesn't have a line, a family line. And if he doesn't have a family line, then he has no future as king. It's all going to die with him. And this really, really troubles him. The next section uses a semantic field of decay and death, and he highlights here the effect that Duncan's murder has had on him. He says he has defiled his mind. He's murdered the gracious Duncan and put rancors in the vessel of his peace. So he's talking about the cost to himself. His mind is corrupted. His peace is corrupted. Rancors are like sores or cancers. And he's committed the worst form of murder possible. So these are all of the things that murdering Duncan have caused to happen to him. And as we've said, this is how much Macbeth's character has deteriorated. He also seems to speak fondly about Duncan, and we mustn't forget that it was only a couple of scenes ago that Macbeth murdered Duncan in cold blood while Duncan slept. But here he talks about Duncan being gracious and talks about him really fondly. And it's almost like he's blaming Banquo for making him murder this good man. It's all Banquo's fault. And the exclamations at the end of the section show how angry Macbeth has made himself by reflecting like this. He's talked himself into hating Banquo. He's talked himself into believing that it's all Banquo's fault. It was all for Banquo. Of course, Banquo had nothing to do with it, but this is the way Macbeth is trying to rationalise killing his best friend. So at this point, we discover who it is that's been waiting at the gate, and it's two murderers. And the attendant brings them in, and Macbeth sends the attendant off so that he can be alone with them. And we realise that this isn't their first meeting. Macbeth has met with the murderers the previous day, and he's talked to them at length in an attempt to convince them to murder Duncan, and he's brought them back so you can see what they've concluded. Now, notice that Lady Macbeth isn't present. So we talked last week about the beginning of the breakdown of their relationship. Lady Macbeth has no idea what's going on. But what's interesting is through the next section, we see Macbeth using many of Lady Macbeth's persuasive techniques. So all the methods that she used on Macbeth to convince him to kill Duncan, we're going to see Macbeth using on the murderers to convince them to kill Banquo. So you could argue that if you remember, Lady Macbeth willed Macbeth to come quickly to Dunsinane so that she could pour her spirits in his ear. You could argue that she has corrupted him. Now, you know that I personally don't think that we can blame Lady Macbeth, but that's one way you could argue it if you are convinced it is all her fault. So how does Macbeth persuade the murderers? Well, first of all, he presents the hardships that these men experience in life as being Banquo's doing. He says, you thought it was all me, but actually it wasn't, it was Banquo. And so he turns Banquo into an enemy. He makes him out to be a really bad man. He's shifting the blame. Now, the implication here is that it is Macbeth's fault. Macbeth has always treated people badly. But here he's shifting the blame onto Banquo. It wasn't me. I'm innocent. It's all Banquo's fault. And he defames Banquo's character. So he makes the men believe that Banquo is not a good guy and that he deserves to be killed. So this is his first three techniques. Now these are quite rough techniques. They're not particularly successful and aren't particularly convincing. So when this isn't working, he moves on to some more artful, persuasive techniques that he's learnt from his wife. Now, one thing we can do is compare this to Macbeth's last words before he goes off to kill Duncan. If you remember, he said that the bell that Lady Macbeth rang was a knell that summoned Duncan to heaven or to hell. And what he was doing there was suggesting that Duncan might actually not get into heaven. He might not be righteous enough. And so he sows the seed that Duncan might deserve death, and it makes him feel better about killing him. And so he's doing something similar here with Banquo. It wasn't convincing with Duncan though, and it's not convincing here. So he moves on to some other methods. Now, before we look at those, just notice that Macbeth is speaking in blank verse here. So blank verse is iambic pentameter that doesn't rhyme, and this is reserved for noble characters. So this is another way that Shakespeare is showing us that Macbeth is trying to be kingly. He's trying to speak like a king. His language is an attempt to reflect his status. Right, so another way that Macbeth persuades them, he questions their bravery and masculinity, and we know we've seen this before. So he basically says, do you find your patience so predominant in your nature that you can let this go? Now, patience was an attribute that was associated with femininity, that nurturing, caring quality. And so he's implying that they lack the masculinity that they need to do something decisive about Banquo's treatment of them. And we've seen Lady Macbeth do this before. Do you remember she said to Macbeth, when you dared kill Duncan, then you were a man. So she insulted his masculinity. He also Macbeth implies that the murderers have been tricked, that they don't know their own minds. And so he's suggesting that they've been led to believe that it's their duty to pray for Banquo in order to make them, in order to suppress them and stop them taking revenge. And again, we've had Lady Macbeth suggesting that Macbeth must have been drunk when he was going to when he was going to kill Duncan, and that now he's sobered up, he's deceived again. So we've seen that technique before as well. He also, once again, suggests that Banquo and his son now, remember Fleance is only 8 or 9, Fleance is also to blame for the poverty and oppression that the men experience. So again, he's throwing in again the fact that Banquo is the enemy. And it seems that Macbeth's persuasion is starting to work, because the first murderer's response shows that it's this suggestion that he's less than a man has got to him. He responds with, "We are men, my liege." And remember how Macbeth responded when Lady Macbeth used that technique. He said, "I dare do all that may become a man." And so it's working in the same way. Maybe Shakespeare suggesting that men are quite easily manipulated. I don't know, you could argue. Now, just like Lady Macbeth, once he sees that it's working, presses his advantage, and he says, "Yeah, okay, you've got all the bits that make you a man, just like all dogs have got all the bits that make them a dog. But the question is, what quality of man are you?" So he says, "Yes, you are men, but what kind of men are you?" And remember, Lady Macbeth did something similar with Macbeth. To be more than what you were, you'll be so much more the man. If you kill Duncan, you'll be more of a man than you are already. So this is another borrowed technique that Macbeth has taken from his wife. And he follows this up with a challenge. He asks them to prove what quality of men they are. He says, if you have a station in the file, if you are ranked in the file of men, you've got to prove that you're not in the lowest rank. Prove it. Do something that's going to convince me. And again, this is like Lady Macbeth when she said to Macbeth, "Are you going to prove that you're not a coward? You say one thing, but you've got to prove to me that you're not a coward by acting on it." So this again is borrowed from Lady Macbeth. Now, another method he uses is making the murder sound more legitimate. So here he uses the word execution. Now, an execution is like what a soldier would do on a battlefield with an enemy. It's a legitimate killing. And if you remember, Macbeth used the word assassination to himself when he was talking about killing Duncan. So this is his attempt to legitimise the murder by calling it by another name. Still murder, though. He also tries to bribe them a little bit. He promises them special favour. He says that if you kill Banquo and are successful, it will grapple you to my heart. It will tie us together. You'll have the ear of the king. And he's tried this with Banquo as well. Remember, he says to Banquo, "If you cleave to my consent when 'tis, it shall make honour for you. It'll go well with you if you're on my side when I'm king." And Lady Macbeth did something similar. She used emotional bribery. "If you don't kill Duncan, then you can't possibly love me." And so we've got something similar going on here. What we're seeing is that all these methods are learned from other people. Macbeth has got all these techniques from other people. He also suggests that Banquo being alive is making him ill, and so he makes the murder of Banquo sound like a legitimate service to the king. You know, king is God's appointed servant. You should do everything you can to serve him. And so this is Macbeth trying to make it sound more legitimate than it is. Now, it works because look at how the murderer responds, the second murderer. He says, "The vile blows and buffets of the world have so incensed that I'm reckless what I do to spite the world." He's basically so moved by anger about all the injustices he's experienced, he will do anything now to put them right. And if you want a comparison, think about how Macbeth responds after Lady Macbeth has worked her magic on him. He said, "I am settled and bend up each corporal agent to this terrible feat. I'll do it with every bit of myself." So we've got a similar response. And the first murderer echoes this. He says that he is weary with disasters, tugged with fortune, that I would set my lie on any chance to mend it or be rid of it. And so he, again, like the second murderer, is willing to do anything to rid himself of this oppressor, Banquo. And Macbeth almost over eggs the pudding. He again says Banquo was your enemy, and they both agree with him. So just making sure that they absolutely believe it. Now, the question we might ask at this point is, why isn't Macbeth killing Banquo himself? Because he's just murdered the king. It can't get any worse. He's a soldier. He's familiar with taking life. And so why isn't Macbeth doing it? And he says, he addresses that for us. He says, I could, but I must not. And the reason he gives is that he has got to give the appearance of being not associated with the murder of Banquo. And the reason for that is that he shares some friends with Banquo that he's got to keep on side. He can't be seen to be involved. Now, I'm not convinced by this, so I don't know about you. That sounds really quite flimsy. Now, there are lots of possible explanations for this. I'm going to suggest two to you. The first one is that Macbeth is actually scared. Remember how he was immediately after the murder? He wouldn't go back into the chamber to replace the daggers because he was scared to look on it again, and he was tormented by the blood on his hands. And so one suggestion is that Macbeth has lost his nerve and can't face the sight of blood anymore. And so when he says, I could kill Banquo, but I mustn't, I might ask the question, could he? I wonder whether he actually can kill anymore. We certainly don't see him kill again until Act 5, and at that point his mind is totally broken. So maybe he's lost his nerve. And the second possible reason is that he just doesn't want to be associated with it. Maybe he thinks that if somebody else murders on his behalf, he won't be responsible, and so he'll escape some of the consequences. Remember, he was really preoccupied with the consequences of murder, and so maybe this is an attempt to escape those consequences. So perhaps this is another effect of the murder of Duncan. He's so terrified about what will happen to him that he can't face murdering again. I'll let you ponder that and come up with your own suggestions. What we do see from Macbeth is an open admission that he's being duplicitous. He says that he's going to pretend to grieve Banquo's death, even though he struck Banquo down himself. Now, this is a bit of a contradiction because on one hand, he isn't killing Banquo, but on the other hand, he takes full responsibility for Banquo's murder. He says that he himself struck him down as if he was going to kill Banquo by his own hand. So he openly admits to duplicity here. That's something new. We haven't seen Macbeth do that before. And look how this scene comes to a close. The first murderer is about to say something and Macbeth completely cuts him off. Now, there's again a number of reasons why Shakespeare does this. Perhaps Macbeth is getting so excited about the plan that he doesn't wait for anybody else to speak, or perhaps Macbeth is revealing something else about himself here. The murderers have agreed to kill Banquo, and so he doesn't need to be polite to them anymore. He doesn't need to win them round. And so he's got no time to hear them speak. He dominates. He's the one who's got the most lines. And so what the murderer has got to say is irrelevant. And so perhaps this is Macbeth revealing more about his character, showing us that he uses people. While they're of benefit to him, he'll pretend to be nice. But the minute that they're no longer useful, he goes back to how he really is. Now, he says that he's going to meet again with them within an hour to give them the plan. And just to be clear, just so that we know it's Macbeth that's initiated it, he clarifies that Fleance has got to die as well. And this is Shakespeare showing us that it can't get any worse than killing a king. Once you've killed God's second in command on earth, it can't get any worse. So now we've got an innocent child who is going to be murdered, and Macbeth's sins are so bad, it's so deep that it can't get any deeper. And so he states very clearly, so that we know it's him initiating it, Fleance is going to die as well. And the murderers agree, and off they go. And the scene ends with this interesting line that's very similar to the last lines before Macbeth went off to kill Duncan. He says, "It is concluded, thy soul's flight, if it find heaven, must find it out tonight." And again, Macbeth is implying that Banquo might not get into heaven. He's once again convincing himself that that Banquo isn't a good man, and trying to ease his conscience a little bit. So what's important here? I'm just going to move myself so that I'm not covering over. So what's important? First of all, Banquo is already suspicious. He remembers the witch's prophecies and knows that Macbeth had a motive to kill Duncan, and he's likely to have been the murderer. Secondly, we see that Macbeth is dissatisfied with a crown that isn't going to be passed on to an heir, and so ambition hasn't left him. And he reveals to us that not having a son is a significant issue for him. It's a really big deal. He's also openly duplicitous now. He's not even pretending. He's openly confessing to being fake. He uses some of the persuasive techniques that Lady Macbeth used on him in order to persuade others to do evil. And what's really important is that he's unwilling to commit any more murders by his own hand, but he's quite happy for others to do it in his place. And he is now willing to kill children. So we've killed a king, children can't make it any worse. So now he's freely killing children. So your turn. This week I want you to do a practice exam question. So here's our question. How does Shakespeare present the deterioration of Macbeth's character in Act 3, Scene 1? So we're going to use the scene as if it were an extract in an exam. You'd never get anything that long, but just so you've got plenty to say. And the bullet points here remind you of the 4 assessment objectives. So AO1 is focus on the question, your analysis skills and the way you incorporate quotes. AO2 is analysis of language, form and structure. So that's where you get your methods and their effect in. AO3 is links to context. Now it's tricky in this scene, but it's not impossible. So I want some links to context. And AO4, which is the one that everybody forgets, is accuracy in spelling, punctuation and grammar. And that's worth 4 marks. So that's what the 30 plus 4 is at the bottom of the screen there. So I want a complete exam response. If you want to practice writing to time, give yourself 50 minutes because that's roughly how long you'd have in an exam. And don't forget your point, evidence, explain, link. Stay focused on the question and get as deep into the methods as you can. Remember, this is about language and form. So you can talk about language devices that are used, but also the dramatic techniques that Shakespeare is using. So I hope that was helpful. Look forward to seeing your work, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Bye.